is Art in the Raw. I'm your host, Ann Kelly. Art in the Raw is a series of conversations with creative people designed for both your entertainment, but also to provide free art education. Tonight, we're talking to George Covalla, who's both a passionate analog photographer and happens to be the first ever photo editor at Snowboarder magazine. In this conversation, he tells us about the work he's making today with analog cameras on the streets of LA, and he also shares some stories about being a young photographer and snowboarder trying to get his photographs into snowboard magazines. Spoiler alert, he pulled it off, and that led into being a key figure in the sports photography industry. So we go a little bit into commercial photography as well as fine art photography, and sometimes I think it exists kind of in between.
Yeah, I remember when I met you because you were like, "Oh, I snowboard." And I was like, "Oh, that's cool," because I always have a common touch point with somebody who snowboards. I started snowboarding in 1983, Vermont. So literally, I grew up not very far from where Burton started in Manchester, Vermont, or it started a little town outside of Manchester. But when I was a little kid, I used to go to the Burton factory. And that wasn't even much of a factory. And they made wooden boards. The boards didn't have PTEX yet. I was probably 12 or 13. They would put an advertisement in the local newspaper, like they were selling seconds with paint blemishes for $75. So I had my mom drive me down there, and Jake Burton would be there. And that's kind of how I got involved with snowboarding. It would be like the East Coast version of Dogtown. It was like all in its infancy, but I was just like a little kid, I got all the skateboard magazines, Thrasher, Transworld, and I liked all the images in there. I liked looking at them and trying to imagine like what was outside of the frames. I would see all these pictures in these different places in California and stuff, but I'm like, what's outside that I can't see? Like, what's it like there? Like, it seems so exotic to me. So I kind of wanted to shoot photos around here of snowboarding because it's accessible to me. And we didn't have any skateboarders were good enough really at that time period to shoot. So I got a camera when I was like probably 15 for Christmas, like a Canon, maybe a T50 or a T70. And I remember that morning went out and got my brother to go down the hill, go off this like little boulder thing, and all this powder came up, and I shot a picture, but I didn't know to do it at 500th of a second. So it was a little bit blurry, but I was addicted. Then I was like, oh, this is cool. I envisioned something happening. I shot it. It happened. Then I was like, okay, I really want to do this. And I love snowboarding, but I love capturing all these people. So I started going to the US Open, which was a huge event in Vermont at the time when the pipe was hand dug and everything. I used to go and like, I wasn't allowed on the side of the pipe yet. And I would like lean over and shoot pictures. I would get those back and look at them and then be like, oh, they're not quite like the ones I saw in the magazine, try to figure out what I could do better. But eventually I ended up moving to Burlington and going to college. And up there was a bunch of really good snowboarders. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to do this when I go out. Like, I'm going to have my camera and I'm just going to shoot pictures. So then I started hooking up with these people like Seth Neary, Seth Miller, my good friend Herb George. All these people were like up and coming snowboarders. And then there was Jeff Brushy, who was already established. I didn't really get to shoot with him as much, but definitely all the up and coming guys, I just built a rapport with them, and I would go out with them all the time. And it was easier to approach magazines at the time because you could just call them up. There was no email that I remember. So I remember calling up Snowboarder and Transworld Snowboarding and being like, hey, I shot some photos. Can I send them in or whatever? And they were like, yeah, yeah. And they gave me the address, or the address was in there, but they told me what to do. So I sent some in. And I don't think there was a lot of East Coast photographers at the time. There was a guy named Trevor Graves. He to this day, his photos still stand up there. Incredible, beautiful stuff. So I'd seen him shoot, and I've been lurking behind him when he would shoot. I'd kind of see what he was doing, try to figure it out. I eventually got to know him a little bit because I worked at this snowboard shop called the B-Side, which was like one of the biggest snowboard shops in New England. So we had like a lot of riders coming through there. So that was another way for me to get to know all these people. But as I sent in these things to the magazine, they started printing little photos like here and there, and I would get a check. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to hone this in even more. And I started looking and being like, oh, like they have this section of the magazine every month. Maybe I can talk to them and try to fill in this section. And I'd have to write the words and stuff, which, was a little tough for me. I wasn't really a writer, but I tried. But then after I had this happen for a year or two, Snowboarder one year was like, okay, we're going to send you $500 and you can buy whatever, $500 worth of film or put it on developing or whatever you want. And just send us all the photos the winter. They knew we were having a good winter. So I was like, this is awesome. You could get quite a bit of film for $500 at the time, a couple bricks. I got Provia or something. And we had an epic winter. So I just shot like all my free time. I just went and shot in the streets, which street snowboarding was really just starting then. Wasn't a big thing. And I shot on the mountain. I ended up with some pretty good images and I sent them into them. And I didn't hear back from them. And then the magazine came out and they gave me a whole article, maybe 10 spreads. And I was blown away. And then everyone in the town where I live all wanted to go out more because there was more evidence that, it was going to work out. So I shot for them for like maybe 2 years. And oddly enough, one day, this guy, Doug Palladini, he was the editor of Snowboarder magazine. He calls me up and he's like, we need to get a photo editor because they had been using the photo editor from Powder magazine as well. This guy, Dave Reddick, at the same time. But they're like, can you think of anyone that should be photo editor?
You're like,
and I was, well, I honestly didn't think myself because I was like, oh, I'm just this kid from Vermont. They're not going to let me do this. But I named all the people I thought. And then at the end I put, but I'd give my right arm to be the photo editor. I just threw it out there. And they're like, really? You'd be into that? You'd consider moving to California? And I was just like, yeah, of course. I definitely would. So they, he talked to me on the phone a little bit and then they're like, okay, we're going to bring you out to interview you. And I was just like, kind of blown away. I was like, wow, like this is where all my heroes shoot photos. And now they're flying me to California for an interview. So I went out there, interviewed with them for a few days, met the staff, everything worked out. And they're like, you got the job. So they're like, when can you get here? I literally got back to Vermont. I must have packed up my whole life in like 3 days into one car, a Ford Escort wagon, drove it across the country in 4 days, got to the magazine and was like, let's go. It was pretty cool. And then after that, they ended up sending me to Europe like shortly afterwards. And I'd never been there. And that's a whole nother story, but it was eye opening. I was 24 years old.
Please like, comment, subscribe, share with like-minded friends because the YouTube algorithms are rather complicated and don't always favor long-form content. You combined your love of snowboarding and photography and turned it into a career and you were the first ever, not just the photo editor at
I was the first ever,
but you were the first ever photo editor then. So that's an amazing thing.
Yeah, it was cool. It was like the gold rush of snowboarding because every year the snowboards were evolving, the tricks were evolving. There was a lot of money coming into the sport. The magazine was 276 pages. They were turning away advertising that was non-endemic. That's how well they were doing. But this was the weird thing. I'm there, I'm the photo editor, and then all my heroes are like, who's this guy? I've seen his name in the little photo credits, but they're like, he's going to be editing my photos. I think that was a little weird for them. And it was a lot of pressure on me. I was like, oh man, like I want to do right by them and the magazine, but only so many photos can make it in the magazine. We probably got 20,000 photos a year. A very, very small percentage of those make it into the magazine. And on top of that, you want to make the magazine well-rounded. You want to have some big mountains, some street, some, on resort, all of this stuff. You only had so many spaces to fill. And then you had articles that were planned for the year. And eventually a lot of stuff that was really good fell by the wayside. And people sometimes get bummed. And I fully understand that. But at the same time, that was all you could do is try to, really be well balanced. But getting to know all those people that I admired in a really close way was really cool. But after a few years, it's like being a team manager. These guys will call you at home. They'll call you all the time, just trying to like plead their case about something. So it got a little stressful sometimes, but it was a really cool experience.
And then we should also acknowledge that it was the 90s, so it was
Oh
all
yeah.
film photography.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, there's a lot of people shooting film, including yourself for your
Yep.
personal work, but it's very rare that any commercial work is being shot with film anymore these days.
Not too much, but there are little pockets of it now. It's happened a few times recently where they're like, we actually want real film, but like for little snippets. Like they're not shooting the whole thing, but they'll shoot a day of like just to get that authenticity and get that vibe, because using a filter, that's kind of bogus. Like film, just shoot film.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
but I see it here and there. But yeah, like you said, like that's like a very small percentage. It's super small. And I'd say it's more in like action sports. It's a little bit trending right now to actually shoot
Mhm.
film for campaigns, like little parts of it. But anything in the studio, any of the other stuff, that's all shot digitally. Yeah, for sure. But one thing I think is interesting today is like, so I like and dislike it, is these kids, they can put their stuff up on Instagram
Mhm.
and they can put all their stuff up there. But at the same time, if Instagram had been around when I was at the magazine, it would have been hard because people leak things and then it kind of spoils the surprise. Like when the magazine came out, it was a big deal. I know some younger snowboard photographers now, and they actually really want to have stuff printed in the magazine. Even if that magazine has 1 million viewers on Instagram, they're like, eh, because people just scroll, they see it real quick, and they move on. But
Mhm.
when it's in a magazine, they feel like people study it. At least I know I do. It feels more tangible when it's in a magazine. But I see the plus and minus of it. But I mean, at this point with my photography, I like Instagram because I can just tell a story within a couple slides, couple swipes, and kind of pick and choose what I want to put up there. So it's kind of cool. But I do miss magazines.
Certainly get it out there immediately. But yeah, it is a different experience where people do tend to scroll through the feed quickly. Like you would never look at a magazine at that speed. That would look crazy.
Oh yeah, yeah,
I
you're
saw
right.
you.
Yeah, yeah, that would yeah, it's a really good point.
You're like, what's
I
wrong with that guy?
Yeah, yeah, you'd look like you're like a nut. But I think for me with Instagram, you have the people you follow, and
Hmm.
I'll actually try to digest some of them, like more like people that I'm really into. Like I'm like, oh, okay, like I want to see all of what they're doing, and if it's something cool, just a little remark or something, because I feel like there's a community on there, and then you start finding other like-minded people. And then now out here in LA, I'll run into people on the street, and then you're like, "What's your handle?" And then you end up knowing them through Instagram before you met them on the street. Like they'll be like, "Oh, you're G Charlie," and then you're like, "Oh." And then there's some people around my neighborhood who I could tell they live here because they're like seeing some of the same things, unique things that happen. So I'm like,
Hmm.
oh, okay, this person's walking and going out and shooting a lot, because this might only exist for a day or two. There might be a unique vehicle near, there's this Buddhist temple, and it's got this dome, and there was this yellow 70s sports fan that looked like it was out of a movie that was there. And it was only there like one time. And I know someone else who shot it as well. And I was just like, wow. But that person, I've never bumped into him on the street. We talk on Instagram all the time, but I've never ran into the street. It's weird, but I've run into other people like all over Los Angeles, like just out there shooting. So kind of cool.
Well, I mean, that is an interesting way in that photography has changed with digital photography and Instagram. It's just become a more accessible medium. Like when I started, when you started, not as many
Yeah.
people were photographing because you had to go get
Oh yeah.
those crazy film cameras and learn how to load it and all of these things. And we didn't have a telephone in our pocket that also
Yeah.
had a camera on it. And so it's lower barrier of entry now. It's an
Yeah.
interesting shift, right?
It is. There's some cameras I've shot in the past that I want to start shooting again. I have a Olympus Pen F half frame camera, and
Mm-hmm.
I got introduced by in skateboarding magazines. Like that was really my entry into photography. Was like looking because I love skateboarding, but then seeing how these guys photographed it and the stories were told. And there was a photographer named Thomas Campbell, and he shot a half frame camera. And when they shoot it, they're not just showing the one frame, they're showing the two frames with the bar in between it. So, like in the space of the 35, normal 35 millimeter, there's two photos with the bar in there. So they might shoot something and then like split it so the image is like, off a little bit, or like shoot totally two different things. But like there was a lot of artistic type photography in skateboard magazines in the 80s and early 90s. So, and interesting techniques and printing and black and white. So, looking at these, I had to try to figure out how to duplicate or, make some of this stuff myself and hunt those cameras down. So I miss that because there was a mystery to like knowing how somebody did something. And now it seems like people can just Google it and they're just like, oh, okay, that's how it's done. I mean, that's great. But at the same time, I miss the mystery because it made me learn stuff along the way. I was learning stuff like by trial and error because I didn't know how to achieve some of that stuff just by looking it up. So I want to start shooting that again. The only thing that's a pain in the butt is I don't get it cut. I just have one long strip because I want to be able to pick where I have the two pictures together.
Mm-hmm.
So the camera's a little more of a process. And as is right now, I used to go out with like a medium format camera, a Bronica, set it up on a tripod and shoot, square medium format photos. And that's on a tripod. And it really made me slow down, really made me like think about how I was, cropping, how I was like shooting. But then like in the last 2 years, I had my Leica with me, then I'd have my half frame, then I'd have a Polaroid SX70. I'd be like shooting all these things of one thing. And I was just like, it was like tough. Like, you know what I mean? I liked it, but then I was like, so recently I just really been keeping it to my Leica during the day and just using that, my M6, going out and shooting. But thinking about it, I'm like, it'd be nice to go out with like the half frame too, as well. And then just kind of maybe tell two stories, like regular 35 millimeter stories and then more artsy stuff with the half frame. But all that stuff I saw in skateboard magazines, they would have a photo annual, and it was like I couldn't wait to see that thing. Like, because these guys were, it wasn't just like tricks. They were shooting humans and personalities. I see that less and less these days. Like any of these kids who shoot action sports or other stuff, I think everyday kids shoot sport personality, but I think like people who try to do it professionally don't shoot as much personality stuff of these characters. And maybe the people aren't as big a personalities. But back in the day, Sean Palmer was this professional snowboarder, and he would wear this red, white, and blue American flag suit and have a mohawk and just like riding the half pipe. He was unmistakable. And there was all these people, and they all had their own thing. And you could kind of feel their vibe through those photos in the magazine, and people would imitate them. Like every town had a kid who wanted to be Palmer. Every town had a kid that wanted to be Lance Mountain and skateboarding or whatever it is. So they got all that information from those magazines. So I don't know if kids are getting it the same way in Instagram, but they could be.
Well, so what's interesting to me is all of your early photography influence was mostly snowboarding and skateboarding, but the photographs that you put out there into the world, your personal art photographs, are not that. They're more
Yeah.
in the street photography, new topographics kind of genre, if we're gonna put it
Yeah.
into
Oh, yeah.
a genre. So do you want to talk about that?
I would love to. This was a while back, maybe 15 years ago. I had seen some Eggleston stuff. I think that's an entry point for a lot of people, but I still go back and look at Eggleston. I'm like, damn, man. Like even when they put out the books where they show work that he hasn't had published as much or published, I actually almost end up liking that stuff more. So I like Eggleston, Gary Winogrand, Joel Sternfeld, or I think I might be saying his name wrong. Fred Herzog from Canada and from Vancouver. I
Mm-hmm.
love his stuff. Like the way he has people in there. There's this one where that guy's on the street and it looks like it's morning or something. And he looks like he's done shaving and there's like a little piece of white toilet paper in his face because, I'd cut himself and he's like got his hand up, I think, and he's looking down the street. I was like, I think he's really underrated, but I like Wim Wenders is another person, the filmmaker. I saw his book and he went out and photographed all these places before he shot them in like his movies. And it's like attention, but it looks so boring. Like some of the photos look so boring and mundane, but they're capturing something that is in that moment, a mundane that is so beautiful. And it looks like a little still from an art film. That's how I view it when I go out shooting. I want to capture something that's like looks like a little still out of a weird art film. And then it tells a story. And then I used to like not like people to be in the photos, but now more and more I like people wandering into the photo, especially if they're unique or they're off in their own world. And it kind of starts to tell another story. So I kind of like cruising around and you can see a house 50 times, but if you see it with the right light or it's foggy that morning, but like the light's coming in through the clouds just in one section and it's like dark over there. And then all of a sudden this rose bush is like coming to life in one spot. All of a sudden you're like, whoa, like I've looked at that a million times and it didn't quite look like that. And that's what I like to try to capture. It's those little moments that are like you might walk by, but are unique.
Kind of a active seeing. And
Yeah.
you mentioned was kind of a meditative process for you.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So for me, it's definitely like meditation. So if I walk around where I live to go shooting, I'll have music on and I'm just kind of listening to a soundtrack. And I'll start walking like, oh, I haven't been down this street in a while, or I haven't even been down the street. Sometimes I'll walk miles and I'll be like, oh, what's up this street? What's down there? And then when you're walking, I notice I see more things than when I'm driving. Like when I'm walking, I'll notice some weird thing. It's in a driveway in the back or on the side of someone's house or something that they left out there, some weird lawn ornament that's falling apart and it's forgotten. But I'm not going to notice that as strongly when I'm driving. So I like to walk and do that. And I'm definitely dropping everything else in my life. At that point, I'm not thinking about work. I'm not thinking about my sports team or something. I'm just thinking about that moment. I'm just consumed about that. So it's really enjoyable. And like I was also mentioning too, when I'm driving in Los Angeles is really hard. It'll drive you nuts if you let it. So I play this game where when I'm driving, I like to look around and be like, is there something I can photograph? Is there something I can come back and photograph if I can't do it right then? And that makes the traffic way more bearable. Even when I'm stuck on one of the 405 or the 710 or whatever it is, if it's bumper to bumper, I'm looking off the side of the road. If I'm stuck there for a moment, maybe I'll come back. Maybe I'll get off and exit and I'll just drive down there and see. I've never been out there. And out here, I like to call it the city state. The Los Angeles area is massive. It's so big. There's so much stuff to see. And I like to just sometimes get in my car, drive to a part of the city I've never been into, and just start driving down streets and just see what happens. That's like a meditation as well. I just get lost in that feeling. If I won the lottery, I would want to drive across the country, but it would take me forever. I've driven across the country a few times and taken photos, but I've had to, get to A to B like pretty quick. So it wasn't really a thing where I got to shoot as much. But when I met you in New Mexico, I went there specifically to shoot. I went with my wife, Lori. She'll go and she'll shoot with me too. And we'll just have some places we want to go and then drive. And New Mexico is great. There's a lot of incredible stuff there. I wanted to tell you a story. When I was there the first time, there was like an abandoned motel on the side of the road. And I was like, oh, I want to shoot this. But prior to getting into it, we were driving and there's this guy on the side of the highway and he's wearing it's hot, but he's wearing a leather jacket, all this stuff. And he's a heavy metal looking dude, but he's wearing a mask, like a rubber mask. It looks like someone's face has been sliced up and like sewn back together. And he's just walking in the heat wearing that. I was like, oh man, I wish I could shoot that guy. But I just didn't want to pull over on the highway right there, jump out and like shoot him because it just seemed like an odd place to do it. But it was maybe a mile up where that motel was. So I pulled over. So we're shooting and she can't see. And I can see the guy coming. And I'm like, oh, whoa, he's coming this way. He's walking up the road, but he's wearing this mask. And I was trying to wave to her so she wouldn't be frightened when she saw this guy. But then he kept walking towards me, and I was just shooting and shooting, and I wasn't looking at him. And then he got close, and I think he thought I'd be like scared or shocked by like the way he looked. But I turned around and just shot a photo of him, and I was just like, that is so awesome. I was like, I love what you're wearing. And he was just like, froze for a minute, and he was like, thank you. Like under his mask, I could hear him say that. And I think he was more like weirded out by me because I
Yeah.
think he thought he would get a different reaction. But I was just
Mhm.
like, oh man, I can't wait to shoot this guy. So that's another thing when you're out there, you see unique individuals. Like I'll see them coming for a ways, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to try to position myself to shoot this person. You know, when they hit this point, try to do it, and hopefully not have them notice too quickly. Because every once in a while, I don't mind when they're looking right at the camera and they notice you do it, but I've had once or twice where they put their hand up, like this or something like that, and I guess in some way that would be unique if you had a collection of those where people put their hand up, not wanting to be photographed, but I'd rather capture them, not really knowing that I was going to shoot them. But anyway, that was part of going out to New Mexico. I love it out there. It's beautiful.
Was that in Santa Fe, the
It
mask guy, or another part of?
it was between Albuquerque and Santa Fe.
Okay, okay.
You know that abandoned Native American mall?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's like before that or after that by 5 or 6 miles.
It sounds like you have a great partner in crime.
Oh yeah. Well, speaking of going on these trips, we went to Vegas one time. A lot of the stuff I shoot sometimes, and especially when I go to these other cities, is in rougher parts of the town.
Hmm.
And sometimes you're going to encounter people that, like for instance, there was this one time that we were out in the desert, and it's like rough little town. There's nothing going on there. And I was driving through there with Lori, and I see this like muscle car, but it's like kind of bondo together, and it's parked in front of this auto parts store that's like rough looking, and it's got this American flag. And then next to it's like this ballerina place or something, a dance studio. And I'm like, I'm getting out. I got the medium format. I'm trying to get my tripod set up before the person comes out and the car moves and everything, and trying to get it set up. And I shoot it. I shoot the photo, and then this guy walks out, and he looks like a rough customer, and he's like older, but he looks like I don't want to tangle with him. And he looks at me, and he looks at me shooting his car. So I was like, oh, I got to diffuse this right off the bat. So I'm like, hey, how you doing? How you doing? And he comes over and starts talking to me, and he's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, oh, your car is beautiful. I love this scene. I'm like, here, look through the viewfinder. Look at what I'm doing. And he's like, oh. And then when I usually show people something on Instagram, what I do, they go, oh, okay, cool. But then he starts telling stories about being a sniper in Vietnam and all these other crazy stories. And I was like, I'm really glad I didn't get on the wrong side of this guy. I always try to diffuse this stuff. But that being said, when I was in Vegas, Lori and I went down into this one really heavy duty section, but it has the oldest signs, like these old, big, beautiful signs. This is part of Vegas that nobody goes to. And we were down there and we're shooting, and I noticed that there was a lot of prostitution going on. And I've dealt with this a few times with some of the places I've shot. There's prostitution happening there. And so I always have to be pretty careful. I've had a pimp come out before one time when I had something on a tripod, and he was like looking at me. And again, I showed him the photo, like what I'm doing. And he was like, okay, whatever. He didn't care, like took off. But when we were down on this street, twice when I was walking with my wife, people pulled over and thought I was offering her up for business. And I was just like, whoa, no. And we walked down there. It was a long way. So I'm like, we got to get out of here. After the second time, I was like, okay, we got to go. So we got all the way back out. And then this lady was like, she came out of her car. She's like, don't go down there. Don't go down there. It's a really bad place. And at that point, I didn't even want the heart to tell her I had just been down there. So yeah, Lori she's a real champion for going out and doing this stuff with me. And luckily, that's one of the few times that we've run into a little difficulty, but she's always a trooper.
She sounds awesome.
She is.
So I would imagine the fact that you're shooting with film cameras, in the cases where you do end up photographing people, people react to you a little bit differently because you're shooting with film cameras as opposed to if you were just walking around with your iPhone.
They do. So oddly enough, I encountered this quite a bit lately because of politics. Sometimes people are like, "Why are you shooting that?" Like they think I'm like work for the government or something. If I was shooting something to be secretive, I wouldn't be using a giant camera. I just use my phone. But they're not getting that. Their mindset is that I'm doing something devious with my camera. But I run into that, but then I also run into people just ask questions, which is like, which is cool because I love to talk to them about what I'm doing. You know, like, oh, this is what I do, and then they're like, oh, okay, cool, and then it's a mixed bag. And I've met a lot of people who know, like, when I was shooting down on Hollywood Boulevard, and there's like all those tourist things with those vans, and they're trying to get people in the vans and stuff. And when they see me with a camera, at first they didn't know. They're used to seeing me now, so they don't ever ask. But they'd be like, oh, hey, like they think you're a tourist, and they're like, you want to go for? I'm like, no, no. And then, but one of the guys who works for one of those vans, I'm walking by and he goes, I see you, rangefinder. And I was like, oh, all right. He knows what's up. He knows what a Leica is. So when we got to talking, and he was a photographer, and then we became friends on Instagram. So a lot of times I meet people on the street with a film camera, and then we become friends on Instagram. And a couple of times I've actually gone to people's art shows and stuff like that after I've met them there. But I guess it just depends on where you are with the camera. But yeah, you do look suspicious out there sometimes. I don't know what it is. Like you try not to, but like if you're just in like a really suburban neighborhood and you have a camera, sometimes people they suspect you're up to something. And I've heard stories where people go into towns and the police pull up on them and ask them what they're doing. But luckily I haven't encountered that too much.
And I would think actually it would be easier walking around with a film camera than if you're taking a shot of somebody with your iPhone. I would
Oh,
think they would actually be more likely to think you were up to something.
I think you're right. When I'm shooting people on the street, like street photography, I think they think it's more special. That's a good point because when I shoot people on the street, like I'm getting right in their grill, like it's not from further away. I have a little system so that they don't get too upset. You have to do it kind of quick, but I usually just be like, I love your hat, love your shirt, whatever it is about them that was unique. Then I'll tell them what was unique, and then I'll just be like, you have great style. People love that. And generally, if I shoot them, they have something going on that's unique because otherwise, probably not going to shoot them unless they're doing something unique in that moment. Younger kids think it's cool because they ask questions afterwards and they think it's more of like a fashion thing or like they're getting noticed, which is cool because they are getting noticed because I'm shooting pictures of them because they're doing something cool. But every once in a while, you see something that's more of a human type moment. I don't generally ever like to shoot kids in photos. It's just because it upsets people, and I understand that. But one time, I was on Hollywood Boulevard, and this lady was on this bench. She's waiting for the bus. She had one kid on this side, one kid on the side, and both of them had their heads on her shoulder. And it was hot out, and they just looked exhausted. And I was like behind them, and you can't see their faces, but I just shot the photo because it was like, it was one of those moments that people can relate to, especially like you have memories like that when you're a kid, when your mom's holding you, and you're like tired and you just want to go home. It was like one of those things I saw. That was like one of the times where I'll actually break that rule. But yeah, that aspect of shooting people on the street it's fun, it's exciting. It was really nerve-wracking at first, but the more you get used to it, the less nervous you get, but you still have a little bit of nervousness. I mean, I don't think Winogrand or any of those guys ever, like after how long they've been doing it, they loved the confrontation or love what was happening on. But also when I watch videos of Winogrand shooting, I notice he tries to act like he doesn't know what he's doing with the camera. He looks like disheveled. Like he kind of looks like this, and so he's like less like in your face about it. I feel like he had a good approach, but there's only a little bit of footage of it, but I've watched it and been like, okay, like that's how he does it. But then also, I love how some of his photos are like tilted. He's
Mhm.
someone who can tilt photos, but they look like they were meant to be that way. Like obviously they were for him, but it's just like I don't try to tilt my photos really like too much. And if I did, I certainly wouldn't, and it wouldn't end up like Gary's stuff. But
Well, he was a pioneer, and especially in the color photo world,
oh yeah,
which, yeah, early on in photography, it was just all black and white. So when color became a thing, it was really a thing. And
yeah. I love all that stuff. And obviously, Robert Frank, I've grown to appreciate his stuff more as I've gotten older. Modern people, I like some of Ari Makropolis' stuff. Ari's super prolific, though he can be all over the place. Sometimes I look at his books and I'm like, it doesn't do anything for me. And sometimes I'm really into it, but he shoots so much. Oddly enough, when I worked as snowboarder, Ari was into snowboarding and we had a little bit of a relationship because he was submitting photos and we were running his photos. And I ran into Ari maybe a year ago. It was the weirdest. I was in downtown LA and the book fair was going on, but I like left the book fair and I was like, looked at this park and I'm like, I'm just going to walk into this park area, like in between these buildings and just see what's going on. And as I'm like pretty far away, like 100 yards, I'm like, is that Ari Makropolis? Like with his beard and stuff. And I get up and I'm like, it is Ari. And I'm like, no way. And was able to talk to him and snap a portrait of him. It was kind of cool to see him out in the wild.
I would imagine a lot of people might wonder, because skateboarding and snowboarding was such a influential aspect to your early photography, why we don't see any of that in your personal work.
That's a good question. I don't currently go out and shoot that stuff. It's a different game. And because I worked in the snowboard industry at 686, it was like part of the job. And I had been editing snowboard photos prior to that for years and doing all this other stuff. So I didn't like want to spend my free time doing it. And skateboarding, it's one of those things you got to like be with those kids and go out and do it. So the spirit of it, even though if you don't see it, it's like once you're a skateboarder or a snowboarder, surfer, the spirit is always there of exploring and pushing the boundaries and maybe seeing what you can get away with. But I do have thousands and thousands of old photos that I've never seen the day of light. So what I'm in the process of trying to do, I just started trying to do, is go through and edit these and put something out, like maybe do like a little book with some of these characters from back in the 90s. I have a lot of photographs of a lot of artists who are part of the Beautiful Losers scene. I bought a lot of artwork from them over the time. But some of the old photos, some of those people have passed away. Some of them, they've gone on to own companies. They've done this. Like they're about 30 years old now. Some of these images, 25, 30 years old. The clothes have changed. The cars have changed. So I feel like they've really come into their own now. As where like when I looked at them when they were only 10 years old, they didn't feel as unique to me. And the people maybe weren't as developed. Their stories weren't as developed yet. So I'm definitely trying to go through and edit those, but I've got to get a good new scanner, start scanning these things. I've actually got to schedule it out because otherwise I probably won't get around to doing as much of it as I would like. I actually probably have to build it into my weekends and weeknights and just start setting like a couple hours here, hours there to go through and start editing them because I would like to put some of that stuff out. So that's kind of where any of that stuff exists for me now is like it's retro, but I like shooting those kids when they're on the street. I shot these kids, they might have been, I don't know, late teens, and they were like death rockers. And they were like kind of nerdy looking too. They look so incredible. And I got a shot of these kids and I was so pumped. I like when kids or people have that spirit when they're younger and they're like, I'm going to do what I want. I'm just going to look the way I want. That kind of carries over for some people later in life. It did for me. I still don't always dress like someone my age. I don't always act like someone my age. Like I do all those things I have to do in life, but I definitely like to have a young mind. It's connected to those things. Like I still watch skate videos a couple times a week. But I guess my spirit's there, but it's a good question. I'm not going out and shooting those kids. I don't think I have the time with a job to go out and dedicate to get to know them well enough to let me shoot them.
But you have those photographs historically, so you could,
Oh yeah.
like you said, if you spend the time, bring that forward. But also in the way that you were talking about the work that you're currently making, it seems like you're almost looking for the same type of things in terms of, you'd mentioned in the past when you were shooting snowboarders and such, you were these characters. And then when you were talking about street photography, you also mentioned the characters. So it seems that you're also pulling from that as well.
Oh, that's the roots. That's where everything comes from. There was
Mhm.
a photographer named Daniel Harold Sturt. I think it was Daniel Harold Sturt the third. He is a legend in the skate world, but an enigma. Shot these incredible photos. There's all these incredible stories about him, and then he doesn't shoot them anymore. But his spirit and Thomas Campbell's and Tobin Yellen's and Grant Britton and all these people, how they shot people and how they made everything look fun or look interesting or look like you wanted to be there. Like, I guess some of my photos, you don't necessarily want to be there because it's like, it looks pretty mundane and boring, but I want some of them to look like you want to be there. You want to be in that photograph and like look around and see what's happening inside of there. For me, it wasn't just like what you saw in the frame, it was what I imagined outside of the frame. That was what it worked for me.
William Eggleston, when you're looking at his photographs, you see little suggestions like a car door open and then
Yeah,
like what's cut off. And then it's your mind that imagines what's happening beyond that.
absolutely. I'm always trying to get better at that,
Mhm.
like editing parts of the photo out and leaving parts in. Those guys are masters at that kind of stuff. Like sometimes I think maybe I try to include too much in. So I've definitely been trying to come in a little bit
Mhm.
and like and you know tell a different story. But
Mhm.
this is weird struggle I have with modern cars. I know if we shoot these cars now, that 30 years from now, those cars are going to look old. But I sometimes really dislike having modern cars in my photo, and it's such a battle because obviously sometimes you just have to have modern cars in there. But I always try to have older cars. But at the time, those guys are shooting new cars. I just think the cars aesthetically lent themselves to better pictures then. Like there's a lot of cars in Eggleston's photos. And a lot of these guys' photos because they're on the road and they're doing stuff. So the car is involved in a lot. They're shooting from a car or shooting cars in it, or like they drove somewhere and it's in a parking lot or a fruit stand or something. I guess is what I'm always trying to have is a little story. Sometimes I'm getting bored with some of the stuff I shoot. After you do it for a while, you're like, okay, I've done this. You're just always looking for something truly unique. And the more you do this, the more you realize you see less and less of those, or it seems less unique to you because you've shot it a few times now. And you're like, I'm really looking for that one thing that's even something I haven't really noticed before or I haven't seen. I'm really hoping like that because you could shoot new topographic stuff to the cows come home and it's a lot of people do it and a lot of it's beautiful and I love it and I enjoy it. But I guess I'm at this point now where I'm trying to find a new way to do it for me. I don't know what that's going to be. I don't know if I'm going to have to start climbing trees or something, but
that
something's going
that
to
could
have to
be
happen.
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure the neighbors would love that.
Well, I have a 20-year-old or so Subaru here in Santa Fe. So if you ever need it for,
Oh,
but I don't really get the sense that you stage your photographs.
I definitely don't stage my photographs. Like it's all happenstance. 100%. I might like be like, I want to go back to this area because I didn't get to spend enough time there. But no, I'm trying to include more modern cars and stuff like that. But I guess some of them just annoy me. I don't know. But those new cyber trucks are so wild looking that I'm kind of want them to be in the photo because it's like going to be like a DeLorean. Like if you had seen a DeLorean in the wild when it first came out and shot photos, it would look amazing then. It would look amazing now. I feel like the Cybertruck's going to be like that.
That is an interesting thought, though, about your work. A lot of your work is happening in real time, but could almost be back in time based upon what you choose to capture. A lot of earlier cars, cool vans.
I just like that aesthetic 60s, 70s, 50s, even 80s. I just something about it to me, maybe just part of my childhood those cars, they look more interesting to me. They have more character. I guess it comes down to character, personality. They're characters. Those cars are characters, just like those early snowboarders, like Sean Palmer or whoever else. Those cars are characters. I guess that's a good way to put it. I guess it comes back to characters again, is having them there.
Looking for the characters.
Trying to include more characters. Hollywood Boulevard is ripe for the picking. It's a couple miles from where I live. Anyone who lives here and is on Hollywood Boulevard is generally a weirdo. I mean that in the best way. They're out there doing their own thing and they don't care what anyone else thinks. And then you have all these tourists from all over the world coming there, and then they think that's what Los Angeles is. That's what they think. It's kind of blows my mind. Because Hollywood Boulevard is really run down these days. It's awful. I mean, it's awful in a good way. Don't get me wrong. I love spending time out there, and I would rather have it look the way it does, and with these people. But so you're getting a mixture of like Europeans, Middle Americans, mixed with people who love to be flamboyant, all like in one big melting pot. So it's kind of like fun to cruise through there and see what pops up. Like there's this woman and she was like posing and you can see her friend in the shadow and she's shooting a picture of her and she's got her hand on her hip and she's standing in front of these stars. And then I have a few, I think, where people pointing at the Hollywood sign or trying to shoot pictures of it. Because when you live near it, you don't think about it. But I actually remember the first time I saw it in real life. You see it on television and stuff, so you're kind of like curious what it looks like in real life. And now I don't really think about it too much. But it definitely, when people come here from other places, they spend time looking at it.
You have a small camera collection. You said you always have a camera when you go out, a film camera.
I always have a film camera. Like 99% of the time, if I leave the house, I have a film camera. Even if I walk the dog, I have a film camera. Like I'm just going to walk her a couple blocks, I have either my Leica or a Nikon 35 L35 AF. And sometimes I'll have my Polaroid with me, like SX70. I have stacks and stacks of Polaroids. I have hundreds and hundreds of Polaroids. When I go out, if it's at night, I'll take the Nikon because it has a flash on it. But if I go to work, I have it on me. If I go outside to go to the convenience store, I have the camera on me. It's like OCD for me. I feel like the moment I don't have the camera, something's going to happen and I wish I could shoot it and I'll be really bummed. So it probably drives my wife a little bit nuts, but it's just
like you got to go home and get the camera type of thing.
Oh, if we were within a couple of blocks, 100%, I would turn around and get the camera. I definitely have to have the camera on me, but I think it's a good practice because some of the photos that I love are because I had that camera with me just going down the street. Like one time I was just walking to the supermarket and there was two raccoons on this telephone pole. There we go, shooting a picture of it. Or there was a shirt out in front of the building I live in, and it said, "I have more time for loving because I've got a microwave oven." And it was just laying in the grass. And and I was just like, all right, I can shoot this.
So do you usually have one camera or two, or?
I'm just going for a walk or my normal routine to work, one camera. But if I'm going out to shoot photos, probably two. And if I'm going on a road trip, like it could be four. Like the Polaroid SX70 comes along a lot. I don't really post pictures of it, but I've been shooting Polaroids for 30 years. What I love is shooting portraits of people that I know with Polaroids because they act goofy for Polaroids. There's something about Polaroids. They're like, oh, it's a Polaroid camera, and they ham it up more. I don't know why, but that's the effect that camera has. So I get interesting stuff from the Polaroid camera. I should try to put together a little self-published book with those. I made a zine a long time ago called Roid Rage.
Nice. So in terms of your life in photography, there's more sides of photography than just A and B, but there's the art side of photography and the business side of photography.
Yeah.
You've really harnessed both. You're living a life in photography, and that's just an awesome thing. And I love how you've connected all of that.
When you put it that way, yeah, it's true. There's been times where I've just been a photographer for money.
Hmm.
It's a tough gig. Shot for magazines. When I wasn't at Snowboarder afterwards, I did some time period where I freelanced. Shot for like Slam basketball magazine, Double XL, Mass Appeal, a lot of different action sports companies. But the thing I didn't like about that was getting the paycheck. It's just hunting that paycheck down was a big job. Like getting the money from the people, you spent more time doing that than you did actually shooting photos, just trying to get paid. But it definitely been every part of my life, even in business, is involved photography, either art directing photography or like setting up a mood board for what we want or just going out and shooting it myself. But when I shot a lot of stuff in the studio by myself on film, it was definitely more nerve wracking than on digital. Because now on digital, when you're in the studio, you're just like, oh, I got it, don't got it. But back then, I remember when we shoot stuff for Snowboarder and we do it in there and you set up the lights and you take your light meter and make sure the light was even. And sometimes you'd get back the slides or something and be like, oh man, it's a little dark over here or it's a little hot over there. And sometimes you'd nail it and it was better than you thought. So the other day, I did actually have to go out and shoot some digital stuff for work. And it had to be flipped around and put on the website and everything that day. And I haven't had to flex my muscles in that way, like film wise, in a while. Where like we got to get the product, we got to get this person, we got to get this vehicle, we got to go shoot this stuff, and we had a couple hours to do it. So that was fun. Kind of reminded me of the old days. Normally we have a little more stuff prepared, but it was definitely interesting to go out and try to have fun. But at the same time, when you're shooting all that work stuff, there's a part of it where you still have to pay attention to how the product's displayed, how it's going to come across, how people are going to perceive it. You can't be as carefree, maybe, or at least I can't be as carefree as when you're shooting your own stuff.
Sure. Yeah, maybe some liberties you would take with your own work. So, in terms of your work, you're shooting
Hmm.
all analog and you make zines. You mentioned some books.
Yep.
A lot of people these days in this very digital world never actually print their work. They shoot it and it's on Instagram or other places. When you print your work, is that an analog situation as well, or mostly zine book?
Mostly like books and zines. I got to make some new ones, actually. The process is always a little tougher than you think it is, like editing down all the photos. And then also, when you're editing your own photos, sometimes it's tough. You were there, so it feels special. Some like, oh, this is a good photo. But then there's other ones, and the feeling when you shot it and the place you were feels really good. But then you have to ask yourself, is this interesting for someone else to look at? But every once in a while, I'm surprised. Like I'll put something up on Instagram where I'm like, I'm just putting this up because I like it, and I don't really care if someone else like it. And sometimes it takes off, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's cool. So it gives you more like hope that people out there enjoy some of the stuff that is maybe a little more challenging. Maybe challenging is not the right word, but obtuse.
If you could travel in time into the future or into the past to make photographs, do you know where you would go?
Oh man, for me, probably 60s, mid to late 60s. Seems like there's a lot of interesting stuff happening. Like the looks are incredible. There's a lot of like turmoil in the United States, but also just the way people dressed and styled themselves, or like the early 70s, somewhere between 60s and 70s is where I would want to go and shoot. I think maybe that's just because I have a lot of influence from other people's work from that time period. 50s wouldn't be bad either, though. The 50s could have been shot a lot differently. I don't feel like the 50s were shot as well as the 60s and 70s as far as artistically.
And if you could acquire a superpower to assist you in your making of photographs, is there a superpower you would pick?
Maybe invisibility, because then you could get right up on people and shoot some incredible photos. So I think maybe that, but at the same time, moving like Flash, like then you could just go from thing to thing and shoot whatever you want to do really quickly. But I would say invisibility first.
That seems handy in what you're doing.
This isn't a superpower, but it's something I wish I could do more and more. Sometimes I want to shoot a photograph, but I want to be in the middle of the street, but the street's too busy. Like the way I want to frame something, so I can't be in the middle of the street. It's just because I'm always shooting with a 50 lens. So it's like, man, if I could just get in the middle of that street, and I've done it, but it's not the safest thing to do around here.
I can see that. I will share a quick story. When I was just getting out of college, trying to figure out what to do with my life as a snowboarder and someone who loved photography, my first thought was, ooh, I should get a job working for a magazine, taking their photographs. And I quickly learned it's very rare for a magazine to have a staff photographer that takes snowboard photographs. That, and at that time cameras were quite large, so I also
Yeah,
realized it was going to change my snowboarding
yeah.
because cameras were not as small as they are now, and I went another direction. But to young photographers out there that want to get into that, making snowboarding and skateboarding and surfing photographs for magazines, is there something you would suggest for them?
Abs- Absolutely. So one thing that I noticed back in the day is there are certain columns that they have to publish every month.
Mm.
I don't know if they do this as much, but a lot of the time they're struggling to find something for that particular thing. So have a point to your photos of where you think they're going to go in the magazine. And also try to have a point of difference to get noticed. Sometimes you can shoot the best. Well, obviously, if you're shooting the best action, then maybe they'll notice you. But at the same time, everybody's shooting great action. I think it's like shooting the peripheral stuff too. Again, might come back to characters, giving them stuff that's going to look a little different. And then just building a relationship with them. Like, I guess now you would do it like via email, but in all honesty, if you live near the magazine, like, hey, can I drop by and just see what it looks like or what you guys are doing? Because when they get to know you, then they'll use you more. But I think it's really just like looking for places to put your images on their website or in their magazine. Because if you notice that there's a lack of something, try to get your foot in the door by shooting what they're lacking. Like they used to have these things where they would interview up and coming people from that area, like for riders. Well, that's one thing I had a lot of riders that they didn't know about, or maybe they were just hearing about. So I could go and do those little one page things for them to fill those spaces. So whatever the equivalent is of that, I would try to find that. But stories, like bring a story with it. If you can write a little thing that goes with it or it has a story around it, that's even better. Then it's like they're going to be interested in it because it's got something else attached to it. It's got some other point of reference than just the photo. I feel sorry it's harder nowadays because I don't think the pay's changed much since I did it at a magazine. I think sometimes they make less per page than they did when I was photo editing. So I think really to make money in that thing, you're going to have to like get in with the companies. And it comes down to getting in with good riders. If you got bad riders, it's going to be tough to make those photos look good. So I think it's really finding a crew of people that are your tribe, but also at the same time have the potential they're getting better and you both rise up at the same time. Like sometimes trying to approach somebody who's already at top of their game, they already have a few people they work with. But coming up with a crew, like that's going to help. Like if you are friends with people that are doing their own thing and are on the rise and you help shoot those photos or do stuff with them, I think that's going to be one of your keys to getting in the door as well. And another thing I wanted to add to this, and it's definitely with snowboarding, is you mentioned with the big cameras and stuff. When I would go out and shoot like on the mountain, you have these giant backpacks, as you know, like, and they're filled with like a bunch of lenses, a bunch of cameras. They weigh like 30 pounds, and they would call photographers turtles because if you fell on your back in the snow, you were just like, it was like more of an effort to get up. And you had to ride like sometimes through the woods with like really tight trees with this giant backpack that's like throwing your weight around, and your hand gets cold. I remember that's another thing when I was like shooting snow, but you get frostbite on your hands. The camera's batteries get really cold. You got to keep next to your body so they stay warm so that you can keep shooting. It's definitely a little tougher shooting in the snow, but skating and surf seems pretty mellow as far as the temperatures are concerned.
Little warmer, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's what I came to is I just wanted to ride and not worry about the camera gear. But now there are GoPros. So
yeah,
speaking of lower barrier of entry, you can just fly through the powder with a high resolution video
yeah.
camera.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah, it really is. So what are the best ways for people to view your work?
I just have an Instagram right now. I don't even have a website right now.
You have two
And
Instagrams.
yeah, one which I don't put up as much stuff. I have to start putting more stuff on it. It's like the street style stuff, but I'm gonna try to mix more of that into G Charlie, the one I use more. I thought about doing a website. I had one, and then I forgot to pay the name on it, and someone jacked the name, so
Oh,
it was
yeah.
gone. So then I was just like, oh man. I think really for me at this point is Instagram, and then I'm going to try to put out more books, limited runs, and I always try to keep really affordable. Like, because if someone's willing to spend money on some of your photos, you just want to make it an enjoyable process. If it's too expensive and it's like hard for them like to have to second guess, like I try to really make just get my money back. This is
Mm.
like what I'm trying to do is just print them because I like it and it's fun. And then like when I did it the first time, I was surprised. I only did 50, but it like sold out in like 2 days. So I was like, that was pretty cool. And I was sending some to Poland and some to England. And then this bookstore here called Arcana,
Mhm.
which I love, was gracious enough to put my book in there on their table. And then they sold 3 that morning, and then they bought another 4 after that. So I was able to sell a few in there, which was cool. I'd like to try to do something bigger, a little more robust. I think I've got the mindset to do it right now. It's one of those things. Sometimes you look at the cost, what it's going to cost to make something really nice, and you look at what it would cost for someone to buy that, and then you're like I'd rather just print something that like I could sell for $30.
Get it out there. And then there's also just kind of a whole zine culture as well that kind of wraps back around to skateboarding and punk
Yep.
rock and
I forgot to mention skateboarding and punk rock go hand in hand. I definitely went to a lot of punk shows, and then Glenn Friedman's photos. That was all like stuff that really got my mind going. And shooting bands, definitely in the 80s and 90s, I shot a lot of bands. They would come through Burlington, Vermont when I lived there, or New York City. But man, yeah, I got to go through and edit that stuff because there's some gems in there. Definitely some people who have left this planet. So
I bet there are some gems in there. Any favorite punk rock bands?
there's a lot. I love Bad Brains. I mean, off the top of my head, and just and photographically, HR, the lead singer, there's that one famous photo where he's jumping off the stage. He's like in a cross thing. He's up in the air and he's just like stage diving. And like, I remember seeing that. I was like, oh, I don't know, 13, 14 years old and seeing that and being like, whoa, you could feel the aggression. I saw Black Flag when I was 14, I think. And Henry Rollins, when you see that in the photo, you could, again, feel the energy. Let's go with the Stooges for the favorite. They're, in my mind, the proto punks. And like Iggy, he's really the first real punk in my mind.
All good bands you've tossed out there. But it's just interesting. I think when people think about photography, they just think of photographs in white mats and black frames on the wall. So it's interesting to think about photography and punk rock and photography and
Oh, yeah.
skating. And it's really a form of self-expression that doesn't have to be limited. Love the story. Any shout outs, anything we missed?
I don't, I probably will hit me later, but I really just say again, thank you to my wife because she's always really supportive of me wanting to shoot photographs, and my mom. My mother always encouraged me to do whatever I wanted, and she shot photos a little bit, and she was just like, "Yeah, go do it. Shoot photos. Go there." Like that helped. And then I just like to say a lot of the skate photographers like Thomas Campbell and Ed Templeton and Grant Britton and all those guys. I'm missing a bunch there, but all of those people, I'd like to give them a shout out because I think they set a certain tone. And sometimes that, and there's people before them, but like the tone just keeps growing and growing and growing off of people's images and what they do.
Well, hey, super fun conversation. Great to catch up with you again. I hope you'll come back to New Mexico soon.
Absolutely. I'm definitely coming back. I love it there.
Well, we could probably keep talking for many more hours.
I'm sure. Sorry I rambled on there. I definitely got a bunch of stories and sometimes they just kind of wander off, but
I've enjoyed the conversation, but we will say until next time.
yep, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining me and have a great night.
You too. Bye.
So if you dig the content, let me know. Thanks for watching. Oh, and if you learned something cool, throw that in the comments below.